Welcome to another episode of the Real Estate Market Minute. My mission is to help you better understand the latest trends in the U.S. real estate market and share with you my analysis and industry expertise. I want to help you gain an advantage and feel confident whenever you're buying and selling real estate. I'm your host, Mark Salib. I'm a passionate real estate professional, advisor, and investor, and I love what I do. Follow and DM me on Instagram at The Salib Group. Send me an email, mark@thesalibgroup.com. And as always, thank you for tuning in to today's show. All right, welcome to another edition of Weekend Q&A. And this weekend's question is, how do you deal with unrealistic sellers in today's housing market? Because there sure are quite a few of them. And honestly, it's becoming a pretty big issue in certain markets because there's just so many sellers that are still mentally stuck in that 2021 and 2022 housing market era, even though conditions have clearly changed, especially in many of the Sun Belt markets, the West Coast and the South, where, and I would call it those boom towns that I often refer to: Austin, Texas, Phoenix, Miami, Tampa Bay, and places like that. All right, so a lot of sellers are anchored to what we call peak pricing, right? Where prices were so high, and they saw sales from a couple years ago that just were eye-popping in some of their neighborhoods, in that their own house was in. And then they got used to these, I'll call it unrealistic online estimates, right? Where you just saw these things where you're like, well, I mean, wow, I could get that much for my house. Now, they talked, people talk, right? The stories they hear from friends: I sold my house for this much and there was a line of 50 people outside and so forth. And I got, 10, 15, 20 offers, sometimes 30 offers. Right? So there's a lot of sellers that got extremely emotionally attached to the value they think their home should be worth, not necessarily what the current market is actually willing to pay. And it changed so quickly that I think it took them a while, and in some cases has still taken them a while, to get used to that change. Right? So some sellers, I just want to say the mental state, right? Some of them don't even need to sell. So they... I see these houses on the market where sellers don't have to sell and they place it super high and they're thinking, well, if someone's willing to pay this much for my house, then I'll sell it to them, because that's a lot. And they really, don't really negotiate much. They just kind of do it like that, right? So now the key thing is this: how do you deal with them, right? And you got to explain to them, look, the first thing you say, the market has changed. Today's buyers are a lot more sensitive to their monthly payment. So you got to think of it, well, it's not just about the price of your home. They're thinking, oh, that monthly payment's going to be really high because mortgage rates have doubled, right? Almost tripled, not quite, but close, but at least doubled in, as far as the 30-year fixed rate. So now they're dealing with higher rates, they're more cautious, and they're taking longer to make decisions, buyers, right? So the monthly payment matters more now than the actual home price in the majority of cases. And I think that's the key thing that sellers need to be taught. Now, at the same time, they need to be taught that inventory is rising in most markets. There's a decent chance that inventory is rising in the market that they're selling in, because it is rising in most markets. And so when buyers have more choices, you can't just, as a seller, you can't just say, well, I'm going to, I was the only game in town. That's not the case anymore, right? They need to be educated that they're not the only game in town. There are a lot of other options for buyers. All right, here's what I'm seeing. What I'm personally seeing, now this is in South Florida, in some cases, right, sellers reject offers initially because they think something better is coming. So they put their house on the market, they get an offer. It's lower than what they're asking, more often than not, and they just reject it. They just say, no, I'm sure another better offer is coming, right? And sometimes it never does. Not like it used to, but I still think they think it is. And then a week or two later, They're calling back, asking if that same buyer who placed that initial offer is still interested. I see this a lot right now. And then reality hits later. And they realize, I'm not getting as many showings. I never got another offer. And then they realize the hard way that the market is softer than what they thought. Now, that's what I'm seeing in a market that was really hot, which is a good example, right? South Florida. So you can compare that to some of these other, parts of the West Coast and other parts of Florida, Texas, Arizona, Colorado. But again, compared to that, you may not see the same thing in some of these tighter Midwest, Northeast markets that we talk about. Situation might be a little bit different there, right? Sellers are in a little bit more control in those markets, right? So sellers don't have to be as realistic, right? The other thing I tell sellers is don't take it so personally. A lot of people, they get so attached to their home. Remember, they're selling their home. Maybe it's a place they've lived in for 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years, right? So, I think what you do is you got to justify this stuff. You got to make this logical for them. Say, look, here are the comparable sales in the area, in the neighborhood, while being respectful about the fact that, they are emotionally attached to this thing they're selling. This is their home. Maybe they raise children there. They're connected. So, but they can't think emotionally. So you got to stay logical. Look at the numbers. This is all about the numbers. This is all about comparable sales in the area, right? The other thing is, I think that pricing, since pricing correctly matters so much now, more than it ever has, the market doesn't care what the seller wants to get or what the seller wants to sell it for. It only cares what is it worth. And that's the bottom line, right? All right. Unrealistic sellers. It's something that we're seeing more of in certain markets right now. But eventually the market tends to force reality into the conversation. And I think that they get educated as the process goes on. But the problem with that is they end up with a stale listing. They end up with a listing that sits where there's price cuts. And, it's better for a seller to get realistic as soon as possible from the very beginning, because it's more likely that the sale will happen. And it'll happen in a timely fashion. The sellers who adapt faster usually put themselves in a much better position than the ones who spend months and months chasing yesterday's market. All right, if you've got a real estate question you want featured in a future weekend Q&A episode, send it over, and I will definitely answer it, whether it gets featured on the show. It's hard to get all of them, but I will try. But either way, I do answer all questions. If you hit me up on Instagram at the Salib Group, I will happily answer any questions that you guys have. That is it for me today. Thank you so much for listening to today's show. And as always, if you have questions or need specific advice, ideas, or just some help regarding your particular real estate needs or situation, or if you're just looking to buy or sell real estate in Florida, well then DM me on Instagram at the Salib Group, or just send me an email to mark@thesalibgroup.com. Don't forget to leave a rating for the show, follow, subscribe, help others find the show, and be informed and educated about the real estate market just like you. Until next time. Before we end today's show, stop what you're doing and subscribe right now to Real Estate Market Minute Plus. Listen to all episodes ad-free. Get exclusive bonus episodes and content, and help support the show's growth, longevity, and future improvements. Go to realestatemarketminute.supercast.com right now. You can also find the link in this episode's show description. Check it out. I know you'll love it.